Right, good evening, everyone. I'm Ian Ralston, the current president of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this extra meeting this evening, and to welcome in particular those of you who have ventured out to what will be our new venue till we see what the emerging pattern of attendance is like. As well as those in the room tonight, we have something like 200 people online distributed around the world. And plainly, hybrid meetings are going to be the pattern, I think, for the foreseeable future. Now, quite how this balances up between people who actually choose to attend in person and those who watch over the internet, we don't know. But meantime, it would seem an extravagance to hire the huge hall in the National Museum. And so, henceforth, really, I think we could say until further notice, I think you should anticipate that our meetings in person will be here. We have a slightly unusual format to this evening's meeting in that I'm delighted that we're going to have two short presentations by newly doctored University of Glasgow students in the fields of music and Celtic respectively. But before that, we also have an election because we've moved to this pattern of 6-monthly introductions of new fellows. So we'll do that little bit of formal business before we move to the lectures. But before we do any of these things, I'd like to ask the director to read the minutes of the last meeting, and then to go on and give us any intimations and bits of new information.
Thank you, Ian. Good evening, everybody. The minutes of the joint meeting of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland and the Prehistoric Society, held at 6 p.m. on Zoom on Monday, the 14th of March, 2022. Ian Ralston, President of the Society, in the chair. The minutes of the previous Society of Antiquaries of Scotland lecture meeting were read and approved. The following communication was read. Connecting tools and materials in the Dutch Late Neolithic through use-ware analysis and experiments by Professor Annelou van Gien, Leiden University, followed by a question and answer session.
Right, can I, in due course, sign these as a correct record of our last meeting? I see nods around the room, so thank you for that. Simon.
Thank you, Ian. I've got 3 notices this evening. Just to say that all fellows should have received their paper newsletter and a link to the online newsletter. If you haven't received one, or if you want another copy, there are some at the desk in the back, so help yourselves this evening. Anyone who hasn't received their link or paper thing, just let us know. We have a reminder that we have new merchandise for sale. We have ties, scarves, so please do look online on our online shop and purchase as many as you possibly can. They're particularly good for Christmas. It's maybe a bit early, but not really. And every penny of profit goes to the Society. Note also that registration for ARPE, Archaeological Research in Progress, the day conference at the end of May, is open. There's a fantastic programme. It also is going to be in a hybrid format in Aberdeen. We'd love to see as many of you as possible either attend that in person or online at the end of May. So please, again, look on our website for details of that. And that finishes the notices for this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, fellows and guests, we have some 51 new fellows who have been admitted to the Society today. The ballot closed at midday today. I'm grateful to our fellow Dr. Murray Davis, who acted as scrutineer of the ballots, and all those who were put forward have been elected. So I'm delighted to welcome them to the Society. I believe some may be present this evening. If so, would you like to identify yourselves? Well, good to see you all. Congratulations and welcome to the Society. I look forward to having a glass of wine with you in due course. Okay, well, our main business now is to hear these two lectures that I've mentioned. We're going to do them as two mini lectures with questions and answers at the end of each because they're distinctly different topics. For those of you watching over the internet, please use the chat function or the other symbol, which I now forget, but one of those symbols to attract our attention. If you want to ask any questions, Simon Gilmore, as director, will be monitoring the feed in from there, and we will take your questions, add in your questions at the end of each session. The first lecture then is by Dr. Andrew Boole, who comes from the Department of Music at Glasgow University. Have we released these conclusions already? Yeah. So you know the point you have to reach, Andrew. Sorry. Okay. From Scotland of many periods from the early times through to the 18th century. He's going to talk to us about the medieval music of the Inchcolm Office for St Columba, and I'd now like to invite him up to address it. Andrew, you're very welcome.
Thank you. And thank you to the Society for inviting me here today. It's very nice to present a little bit of my thesis, which I defended only in February, so it's still quite recent in my brain, thankfully. So the Office for St Columba, contained in Inchcolm manuscript fragments, Edinburgh University Library MS 211.4, are the only surviving examples of notated music celebrating the saint's life from the medieval period in Scotland. This talk will provide examples of the Inchcolm chants to explore how the hagiography of a local saint was merged with the common pan-European music of Gregorian chant, providing a later medieval addition, a later medieval addition to the veneration of St Columba. We can see the first surviving part of the Columban office from these fragments here on the right. It's a rather tatty manuscript, it has to be said. But first, it's worth putting the Inchcolm material into a wider musical context, at least. Scottish medieval music has a fragments problem. So much of what we have left to us is tiny amounts, truly tiny amounts sometimes. Some of which we think are Scottish, we hope are Scottish, but we can only really call them Scottish because they are now in varieties of Scottish places, especially the National Records of Scotland fragments are so small and are so unknown as to their provenance. We can only call them Scottish now, rather than having say they were from a Scottish medieval period. This is another one of them. Just to show you how difficult it is to work with these. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9 different bits of strips that have been used in book bindings at some point, probably in the early modern period, and has now thankfully been retrieved from whatever book they were in, and is now stored in the University of St Andrews in one of their several binding fragments boxes. And it's a very enjoyable afternoon to go over to St Andrews and just rifle through the binding fragments. I would greatly say it's good. It's good. Yeah, it's a good time. So yeah, but at least this exists. Fragmentary is still better than fragmentary and lost. This is a fragment of a breviary containing an office for St Kentigern, patron saint of Glasgow, once owned by Henry George Farmer. It was sent off to be evaluated in London and then disappeared. Consider this a public announcement that this manuscript is still lost to our knowledge, and it should probably be considered stolen property. As far as I can tell, it's just been sold on without Henry's approval, and is now probably in the arms of a private collector somewhere. And this is one of the big issues of medieval music in Scotland, is that what we do have is fragmentary, and then what's fragmentary is then tucked away, hidden away, and otherwise inaccessible. But back to the Inchcolm manuscript fragment specifically. We are lucky they survived at all. They have been used in a bookbinding as well, judging by the damage they sustained to their top sides and their right-hand recto sides. You can see the damage on the top here. We only have the partial text for the final responsory and verse for matins here, coming out the top, Sancta Pulchra sunt tua beate Columba. And we've just lost all that music. Frustrating. The attribution to Inchcolm Abbey originates from Catherine Borland in her 1916 descriptive catalogue of the Western medieval manuscripts in Edinburgh University Library. Here she noted that one of the chants asked for Columba's aid in attacks from the English, ab incursu Anglicorum, here underlined in the red. And another comments that they sing in a place dedicated to him, locumque istum tibi deditum. Borland made the link between this information and the attack on Inchcolm Abbey in 1335. According to Walter Bower, abbot of Inchcolm from 1470 to 1449, Inchcolm was raided by the English on the 5th July, 1335. He writes in his Scotic Chronicon that Edward III, along with Edward Balliol, landed a large force in Perth, with his fleet putting in at the Firth of Forth. A single large ship then raided the island and robbed it of its goods, including an image of St Columba. Bower reports that ultimately this raid was foiled by the intervention of St Columba himself, who altered the wind so that the ship nearly crashed into another nearby island until the sailors repented and promised to return the stolen goods. For a bit of context on Inchcolm Abbey, you probably all know this, but I'll tell you it anyway. Inchcolm Abbey lies here in the Firth of Forth, close to the southern shores of Fife, and was within the see of Dunkeld Cathedral. Quite a noticeable geographic distance, but Dunkeld was also a Columban institution, hence the link. It was likely founded in 1123 and as an Augustinian priory, so there is evidence of earlier Christian habitation on the island as well. It was then erected into an abbey on 22nd May 1235, authorized by Pope Gregory IX. A number of Dunkeld bishops were actually buried on Inchcolm instead of in Dunkeld, probably due to Inchcolm's position developing as a centre of the Columban cult in the east of Scotland, partly even replacing Dunkeld in this role. And even the name Inchcolm is indicative of the island's dedication to St Columba being literally Inniscolum, the island of Columba. There is even supposedly a belief in the Cooper Angus manuscript of the Scotic Chronicon that Columba once lived on Inchcolm during his time proselytizing to the Picts, though no one else says that, so it may just be made that up. But back to the actual music. The material for the Office of St Columba ends in the octave for the second Vespers, with Ave Sanctorum Columba Piissime. Hail Columba, most holy of saints, stock of the king, celebrated islander. Bend your ears to offerings of praise is a noticeable little bit of this. This is one of the three chants I analyzed during my thesis. I only analyzed 3 pieces of music, which I think amounts to about 5 stanzas worth of material, because I went into such ridiculous detail that I managed 3 chapters from 3 tiny pieces of music. You can do that in a musicological degree. It's fine. I just need to do the rest of them now. Next project. It was also the most complex of the 3 I analyzed, so I'm actually going to come back to it later. Just to give you an overview of it a bit more, though. Much material from this office has always been known to be musically borrowed. That is, the tunes that they use were already in existence before this, used in the wider Gregorian chant corpus. Isabel Wood's Priest's 1987 article, Our Owen Scottish Chant Usage in Medieval Scotland, and reprinted in the 2000 memorial volume in her same name, was the first article to really bring this music to anyone's attention, musicologically or in general. And these were her findings on the left, so actually that's cut off slightly. On the left-hand side are the Inchcolm chants. On the right are the similar chants, similar melodies for these chants. So you can see that she sort of divides up sort of the Roman and the Salisbury rites here, and then there's several with the incipits only, so only the opening sections of the melody really match before then Inchcolm goes and does something else melodically. And then she couldn't find anything for these 5 at the very bottom, no source found. After this, John Purser was the next to approach the material, providing analysis of several of the items Isabel had identified to either be unique or incipit only. He worked on a theory that you could tell there's elements of Celtic patterning implicit in the creation of this material. And I know he's still working on this, and there's going to be hopefully a chapter coming out on this soon as well, which is very interesting indeed. More recent work by Warwick Edwards and Catherine Kennedy Steiner and myself, using the Cantus series of databases, which are very useful if you ever find yourself encountering a piece of music, possibly at least Gregorian chant. This is a very useful way of looking at other versions of that chant. This is a wider series of databases that allow for large-scale melodic searches, which have pared down what Isabel Woods Priest found as to be unique down to a smaller number, actually. So actually, it's only 1 or 2 now that we still can't find a melody for elsewhere. So this leaves the Office of St Columba as what we term in musical terms as contrafacta. Counterfeit is the closest English term for that, describing the product of a pre-existing melody being used for a different text. But the definition of contrafacta is a malleable one. There is no hard edge as to where you stop saying it's contrafact and start saying it's a new melody. It's all very blurry in there. So where exactly does one stop calling the difference between a contrafacta and its supposed base as an error and start acknowledging that actually these very small changes at times could actually just be, you know, a Scottish musician deciding to change things, intentional variation. And a group of chants, you can find some of these melodies are shared across other chants. They are sharing the same melodic characteristics, at which point you go, well, which of these many, and sometimes lots of different same melodies being used across the world, which of these are actually the source for the Inchcolm one? And all this complexity and fluidity, I started asking, well, okay, the Inchcolm stuff is definitely borrowed, but within that borrowing, there is evidence of unique melodic elements in there. So that's what I started working on. Let's actually get to the music. So this chant is found on folio 3 recto, one of the antiphons for lauds. It's the first one I analyzed for my thesis. It was also the simplest, which I was very happy to find. Its textual content is also quite simple. Observe of the heavenly saints, saw the glorious triumphal procession of those going to heaven. It's very simple, and you find this theme constantly throughout Adovnan's Vita Sancti Columbae from the 7th century. This is one example from chapter 6 of book 3. You also find them in chapter 7, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 22 of Columba seeing a heavenly procession in the sky. That's fine. That's useful. We know then where the textual stuff is coming from as well. So Isabel Woods Priest was the first to note this chant's similarity to Sequis Mihi Ministra Verit. Warwick Edwards has also agreed with this, says it's near identical, really. And you can see here, if you can read the music, I don't know if you can or not, the melodies are essentially the exact same here. There's only really a tiny difference here in that we have celestium 4 syllables at the end here, Ministra Verit 5 syllables. It's a very small, very, very small change here. But it still shows you that Inchcolm's creations were different textually to what they were borrowing from. They weren't just very slavishly following a specific syllabic pattern. It's so close that actually the damage to the manuscript can be just replaced and fixed with this. Celestium is actually cut off here at the very last note. We can say definitely, sure, that's going to be just an A because we see it's so similar melodically otherwise. But it is cut off, sadly. Moving on, though, we start to see a little more variation in the comparison chants, particularly around here, Triumphum or Pater Meus. So, Inchcolm gives a very simplistic Triumphum. Our first comparison in line goes Pater Meus. Middle one goes Pater Meus. And the bottom, pater meus. That's the reason I've transcribed 3 different versions, because 3 different versions of Siquis mihi ministraverit, none of them give what Inchcolm gives. And it gets even more complex. This is the last stanza. In our first manuscript here, coming from the early 12th century Parisian manuscript, we see we've just got a missing note here entirely. Fine, okay. We go down to our bottom one, coming from a Germanic source. We're missing a note over there. Okay, fine. We're also missing a note there. And we're also got something else going on over here. Starts getting a bit more complicated. So we find ourselves with multiple versions of the same chant, all of which have their own melodic versions, at which point I started having to ask myself, well, how do I talk about 3 different versions of that chant that I want to compare against the Inchcolm chant? It's actually becoming quite complex. So FPN Lat 15182, is that the version that Inchcolm knew? Maybe, maybe not. But in all honesty, the version that we see at the bottom, AKN 1018 with the Dominus version, that's just as common as these other versions. And it starts getting to the point where you find yourself with multiple versions of melodies, and yeah, you find yourself with a very philological quandary of which are which. To return to Ave Sanctorum, this is the last of the surviving chants. This supposedly only shares it in Chippet, according to Isabel Wood's work. It gets more complex as we go along. Again, you can see the themes of the hagiography here, according to Adovnan's work. What's very clear from the get-go with this chant is that we have definitely moved away from simple melodic borrowing into something which I'm calling recomposition. Others may have other terms for this. What's happening is that they've taken the bare bones of melodic movements and have worked around them in varieties of different ways. You can see there's a whole amount of difference in terms of syllables being attached to different notes here. It really does get quite complex. And no matter what version you find, in terms of what chant you're comparing against, this Ave section is always far larger compared to anyone else that you find. My voice, I don't think, is up to singing that. And as you move along, you find it's even worse, in all honesty. So Sanctorum, which is three whole syllables, in order to fit it against some, you're having to stretch out an entire section here in the very top line of comparison here. That just didn't fit in any way, meaningful way. It just had to be put in there. Or you find yourself as having to completely shunt sections along to make them fit. It's quite clear at this point that what Inchcolm is doing with melodies is not simple borrowing, but in fact, using them as a blueprint at times. Just taking the bits that they want, that they feel are useful for them, and then quite happily doing their own thing later on, which leads you to trying to work out exactly where variation starts and creative recomposition begins in all this material. So I had to create a typology, which is not a word I ever thought I was going to have to say when I started a music degree. I won't go through all of this. This is kind of tedious, but you can see there's seven major ways in which Inchcolm varies against other melodies, and within which you can have some smaller varieties of, is it the same note, is it a different note, is it both a different note and the same note? Doesn't really matter that too much. What is interesting is that you come up with 4 major bits of toolbox for Inchcolm's creators and what they use. And the specific circumstances of the chant material require it in some certain points, and there's reasons to for and against. So one of the ones, is the first one, is just adding another note. Very simple, easy to do. Often also just the same pitch. So triumphum. As we saw earlier, there are other versions of this, but with this 12044 sauce, there's only one D. It's a very tiny change, but it shows you because they're changing the text, they have to change the melody. The other Aside of this, though, is when you're adding a note purely for the sake of artistic merit. There is no need to put this middle note in. That G there does not need to exist in any reason, aside from they decided to put it in because it sounded better. You start seeing Inchcolm canons having aesthetic decisions, purely beautifying their chant for Columba. A similar version of that is when they've changed the text. Again, you find they have to change syllabification of the notes happening. And the final one is simple. They've changed the note pitch. The notes are there, they decided to change the pitch. That one in particular, I keep just not finding anything to match. I just couldn't find anything to match at all. And the only reason can be is because they decided to change it, purely because they preferred that sound. So conclusions for this is that, well, I have a lot of work still to do. I only analyzed 3 chants. There's a couple of dozen, well, a dozen and a bit. But what I do see here is something very interesting in that, yes, the Inchcolm Office is contrafacta, it is musically borrowed, but within there, you can see the local variation. You can see where Inchcolm is being altered and changed against the grain. What you also see is that the office's creators were very knowledgeable and very comfortable in this musical milieu. They followed their own paths rather than just sticking to what was presumably had been already taught to them by rote and been taught to them for years. How you perform Gregorian chant, and they have decided, for the purposes of praising St. Columba, that they will change the tune. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Andrew, for that very interesting introduction to music from Inchcolm. Have we any questions or observations from the audience or in line? Caroline.
This is really interesting. Thank you so much for it. I think one of the things that kind of jumps out at me, kind of came together at the very end, is that this really feels like it's just another step in the long line of taking artistic styles that come to Scotland and going, we like this bit, we're going to change this bit, and we're pulling from our own stuff here. And so I can see that coming from, you know, classical Mediterranean styles that comes into the insular style, and that this is just another step that's kind of along that way, and it's really cool to get to see that come through. So thank you.
Yeah, it's definitely. But it's all that sort of same of just, we're going to take what we want from the wider styles and just, yeah, do what we want with it. I mean, to be fair, this isn't just a Scottish thing. You see this. Contrafacta is a wider issue, I think, that we start needing to work around. That I think everyone has their own local styles. Like if I took a contrafacted office from Italy, say, there'll be local things there as well. But in a Scottish context, it's quite interesting to see it happen, yeah.
We don't have any questions online just yet, but we do have congratulations on an excellent presentation, possibly the first time a speaker has sung to the fellowship, from Alison Sheridan.
I wish my voice was up for more, sorry.
And then Rebecca Jones says, I was enjoying the singing too. So I think you should probably do more of the singing. And then there was a note from Adam Cunningham here. There are 2 recordings of the music, one by Capella Nova and one by the Monks of Prisgarden.
There are, yes. There's a few others. Gonville and Keys College did a couple of the chants as well. But yes, the Plusgarden and the Capella Nova are the best.
Sorry, the questions are now coming in thick and fast. I'm trying to keep up. Paul Corrigan asks, super presentation, thank you. Do you see any differences in the chant between Highland and Lowland monastic houses?
Ooh. Don't think we've got enough of either to be able to properly say at the moment. I would love to I'm hoping, if I ever get enough time, to be able to look at everything that we have surviving, and that's not going to be a huge task, to be fair, considering what doesn't survive. But that's a good question to be interested about, that if there are going to be differences. I think there's always going to be differences, I think, between any monastic area, I suspect, but that's a good question. Watch the space.
Future research, yes, exactly. 1 or 2 other questions. There's plenty of statements about how wonderful your presentation was, but I'll just stick to the questions, I think, for the moment. The question here is, can anyone share links to the music by Maeve Gillis? Are there links to the music? Is the music recorded anywhere, or are these digitized anywhere as well?
I think a good portion of the Capella Nova versions are on YouTube now. Okay.
You can look that up. And finally, Robert Ashford asks, did they have accidental notes in the chants?
Oh, accidentals in chant. That's a meaty thing. Yes and no. They kind of, you get a B flat. That's your lot. And B flat sometimes doesn't actually mean B flat. It just means B, or it's trying to function as a class. It's a messy question. You get B flats. That's about it, though. That's the only one you'll ever find.
Hi, I'm filled with admiration for your taking apart these fragments to their minutest bits. It reminds me of a lecture that was given in Orkney in 1987 about the hymn to St Magnus, that text, where I couldn't believe that people could take things down to such tiny details. I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to inject a little bit of cynicism into this. Looking at musical history right throughout, one of the great things that people do is they decorate music. Okay. And they decorate it in a completely improvisational style. Isn't that really what's going on here, do you think? I mean, they'll have had these melodies in their head, but they'll have decided just to sort of alter things themselves. I mean, excuse me if I sing to you for a minute, but I mean, we in our modern times, we have a well-known hymn, immortal, invisible, God only wise. All right, that's what's written in the music. Everybody in church sings, immortal, invisible, God only wise. They put a passing note in. That's because they just want to do it. Yeah. Isn't that really what's going on here, do you think?
Totally. I mean, that's the thing, is that, the vast majority of this Gregorian material is all in their heads anyway. It's all happening up here. So, yeah, they are ornamenting. I think part of this is ornamentation. But I think it's interesting that they wrote it down and decided to keep these ornamentations, alterations, in a physical form. And there's arguments over whether these fragments are from a big manuscript of proper antiphona or whether they're actually a small insertion. And we just can't really tell from the size of it nowadays. But yeah, it's definitely evidence of this sort of creative aspect. And yeah, it's partially just that oral extemporization, definitely. The question is, can you work out which is which?
And can you tell that the Inchcolm fragments are, as it were, the end of the sequence? And is it just assumption that the Scottish stuff must be derived from the others, rather than the direction of travel, so to say, is the opposite?
Yes, myself and Dr. John Purser have gone back and forth on this one a bit, just in private communications. But yeah, there's the potential that the Inchcolm stuff is so old that it is influenced outwards into Europe. But from one, the Inchcolm manuscripts are datable to the 14th century, just from paleographic grounds. And there's no clear evidence for this material having existed earlier. There's a weird thing that happens with the Aberdeen Breviary, in that there is some shared text or shared textual themes between the two, which suggests there was somewhere between the two some sort of archetypical source. But we don't know where that is. That's now lost, which could have told us something about how old the Inchcolm chants really are. You could argue certainly that these are perhaps datable at least to the 12th and 13th centuries, just judging by the similar sources I was finding. So the melodies match to 12th and 13th century sources. But as the question of the Inchcolm stuff having been before the other stuff, I find it hard to parse that, because you would have to have evidence in Europe of the Inchcolm material somewhere in the earliest chant sources, and there isn't. What there is the evidence of these other chants that are comparable against Inchcolm. So, yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Just a quick one. Thank you very much indeed. My question is, speaking normally goes on Scotland, England, mainland Europe. What was the situation in somewhere like Trondheim? Or I don't know my history enough to know if the dates of Trondheim, what was going on at that time, but is there an influence from the east, north of the sea?
Likely, as was mentioned, the St Magnus hymn is a good evidence of there is definitely musical links between Scotland and Scandinavia. So yeah, I definitely don't just go with a Scotland, England, Europe route. There's a big sea there that a lot of people were traveling over. So yeah, I think it's more complex than just a simple from Italy upwards route, definitely.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions, may I thank again Andrew for this very interesting presentation, and the fact there have been so many questions both in the room and elsewhere. I think it's testimony to that. And good luck with looking at the other fragments as well. That should keep you out of trouble for a while. Thank you very much. And so we now pass to the second of tonight's presentations from Dr. Carolyn McNamara, who's now a graduate teaching assistant in the Department of Celtic at Glasgow, where she completed her PhD. And she's going to take us further west. And her topic tonight is Applecross, a multicultural monastic foundation. Caroline, the floor is yours.
All right, technology managed. Thank you also so much for having me here tonight. I'm really excited to share some of my research on Applecross, which I think doesn't get a great deal of attention in kind of the area of history. So just a brief introduction to my research kind of generally. I've focused on St Covgall, who was the founder of Bangor Abbey in the north of Ireland, and especially on the part of his community which covers the west of Scotland. And these are monasteries which potentially made up a community of Covgall, which included Lismore and Applecross, with a possibility that an additional monastery may have been founded on Tiree. So with this in mind, I've been greatly interested as well in monastic networks and travel. But today we'll talk about Applecross, which is the strongest evidence for connection to the monastery at Bangor. And our goal today is really to examine the evidence that shows that Applecross was a place of mixing between Pictish and Gaelic cultures. So as you can see on my very informative map here, that the monastery at Applecross was located on the Applecross Peninsula in Wester Ross, at the mouth of what is now called the Applecross River, though in the 19th century it was known as Avon Marie, or Marie's River, which is a reference to Milrua, its founder. The site overlooks Applecross Bay, which opens onto the inner sound between the mainland and Raasay, Scalpay, and the Isle of Skye. Its situation prioritizes water-based travel over land-based, and the terrain around Applecross is rough and extremely rocky, making overland travel difficult. So we need only to consider Bealach na Ba, the Pass of the Cow, which was the drove road in the early modern period in the area, and only became a constructed road that we might really recognize around 1826. So due to the surrounding geography, the use of boats would have been essential to the functioning of the monastery and the maintenance of communications with both secular and ecclesiastical networks. So the annals are kind of a big source of evidence for us, and they tell us that Milrua went from Ireland to Britain in 671, though it's difficult to know exactly which two places he traveled between or where he was in Britain leading up to the notice of the founding of Applecross in 673. One might speculate whether the time prior to the foundation of Applecross was spent in the area, possibly on Skye or Raasay, though no evidence survives on which to hang a theory. So Applecross was founded and existed within a wider ecclesiastical landscape, which included foundations on Raasay, Eigg, Room, and Skye in its more immediate vicinity, as well as those on Tiree, Iona, and Lismore if we go a bit further afield. The foundation on Rasay is thought to have been founded in the 6th or 7th century, though the evidence for that is not very firm at this point. If stronger evidence could be obtained, it might indicate that the foundation of Applecross was an additional religious house in the area rather than the first in the Inner Sound. So looking at kind of the area around Applecross, it's been described by Douglas MacLean as a Pictish neighborhood, and I think this is a very apt description. In addition to ecclesiastical sites, Applecross operated within a context that included secular sites and people, as it must. From those as close as the Bruch near the monastery at Applecross to those further afield on Skye, or even as far as the Moray Firth and Fortru. The survival of Pictish stones on Skye and Rasay are concrete evidence for the existence of secular power centres in the Western Islands and mainland north of Ardnamurchan in the 6th through 9th centuries, giving a useful picture of secular power at the time of Applecross's founding and development. So within 2 kilometers of the monastic settlement at Applecross sits an Iron Age bruch, and this is situated at the highest point of a low ridge. A wealth of material was found during some excavations that occurred, indicating multiple periods of occupation and reuse, including the Iron Age, the 6th and 7th centuries, and Norse contexts, suggesting that the bruch could have been a local center of secular power and authority during much of Applecross's active lifetime. Today, the site of Applecross is occupied by an L-shaped burial ground containing the former parish church of 1817, which is now owned by the Applecross Trust, and a small 15th century chapel close to the eastern boundary. The 1817 church was built partially over the foundation of a previous church, which may have survived until 1792. Although aerial photographs in 1947 suggest the existence of a large curvilinear enclosure measuring at least 180 meters by 140 meters, the area south and east of the burial ground was planted with conifers in the 1960s, and no surface remains survive. A low curving mound in the western part of the burial ground may represent the small enclosure described by William Reeves in 1857 as the vestige of some ancient appendage of St. Melrua's primitive church. He also described an elevated area to the south of the chapel called Cla Marie, or Marie's Cemetery, supposedly the burial place of the saint. This church was situated within a wider area known as a chavri, or the sanctuary, demarcated by an unknown number of cross-carved stones, one of which until approximately 1870 survived at Camasterach, 4 kilometers to the south, and may now be marked by a broken slab approximately 0.4 meters tall. So now that I've gone through a broad overview of Applecross's location, we can look a bit closer at its founder, Melrua. So the Annals of Ulster don't give us a date for the birth of Melrua, though they do give his age at his time of death. They are surprisingly detailed on this front. So his death is recorded as on the 11th of the calends of May, or the 21st of April in the year 722, at which point we're told he was 80 years, 3 months, and 19 days old. So if this record is correct, that would mean that he was born on the 2nd of January in 642. His feast day is celebrated in Ireland on the 21st of April, and on the 27th of August in Scotland, due to a conflation of Melrua with St. Rufus of Capua. Both the Martyrology of Angus and Martyrology of Gorman from Ireland note that he was a member of Cinnal Eogan of the Northern O'Neill, with his father's name given as Elganach, and he is reportedly related through his mother to Covgall of Bangor, though there are some serious time frame issues with this claim. So Melrua's name underwent numerous permutations in Scotland, which is likely what contributed to the confusion and conflation with Rufus of Capua. It's well known that saints' names could morph, such as the creation of hypochoristic forms, and show up in unexpected forms, such as the charter form of place names, and in anglicized, Scoticized, and Latinized forms. Many variations of Melrua were noted by Reeves. It's likely that this morphing of his name has played a part in the confusion of some sites associated with him being erroneously associated with the Virgin Mary as well as Rufus. These names are all connected with hagiotoponyms, that is, place names that include the name of a saint, or with fairs that were held in his name. And we'll get a bit deeper into that momentarily. So I'd like to dig a little deeper now into the textual evidence that survives for Applecross and its nearby environs. We can start by looking again at the annals. So here we have all of the entries for Applecross, along with entries referring to the region in which Applecross was founded. There seems to be a specific interest in the family of one Gartnet. So discussion of the travails of Kenil Nartnet in the annals shows that the area within which Applecross was founded was of interest to annalists. It's possible that this secular elite was among those with whom Applecross and its abbots developed relationships and would have interacted. Gartnet's son, Cano, was also the subject of a pseudo-historical romance story, Scala Cano MacGartnan. The tale locates a royal residence at Inishmacuchain, which has been identified by Colum O'Bale with Rasse. Kenil Nartnet is a predominantly Pictish kindred, though it seems that later claims to connection with Kenil Navran were created. So what's of interest in these annal entries then is the fleeing of the sons of Gartnet to Ireland in 668 and their return in 670. Although the annals only record the return of the sept of Gartnet, or the people, at 670, it might be assumed that Cano himself was the leader of that party. And though there's no record of his taking up the kingship, it's obvious that at some point he does, as the annalistic record notes events involving his specific family, such as his own death in 688. So Cano's flight to Ireland amidst dynastic problems is far from novel. Terrachin fled from Pickland to Ireland in 699 and may be referred to in Adovnan's story of the exiled Pictish nobleman named Terran, who seeks safe exile under Columba's protection. And additionally, Brood was removed forcibly from Tory Island off the coast of County Donegal in 733, suggesting he had also fled to Ireland for safety. So although it may be coincidence, it's possible that the foundation of Applecross is connected to the movement of the Sons of Gartnet between Skye and Ireland. Macquarie suggests that the Sons of Gartnet may have converted in exile, choosing to bring monks from Bangor to their territory based on this new association with Christianity. However, considering the density of Christian sites in the area, the mentions of Columba traveling in Skye, and the development of Eigg before the martyrdom of Donnan in 617, it seems slightly more likely to me that the Sons of Gartnet had already been exposed to Christianity prior to their exile in Ireland. It's possible that an association between Kenil Nartnet and Bangor was developed when they were in Ireland, leading to Maelrua's subsequent travel to Britain and foundation of a monastic center at Applecross. But we need not rely just on this evidence to understand the multicultural nature of Applecross as a foundation. So even in its name, Applecross, written as Applecrossan in the annals, derives from Pictish aber, meaning the mouth of a river, and Crossan, which was the name of the river that flows into the bay just beside the church, now known as the Applecross River. So one question is whether Crossan comes from a Pictish or an early Gaelic word for cross, and the answer to that may have repercussions for how the origin of the site is interpreted. If we view the name as entirely Pictish, then it's possible that Maelrua did not intentionally choose the name, as has been suggested by Guito Rhys. He argues that Pictish aber was intentionally chosen for the name rather than the previously or currently existing Inver from Gaelic. And he argues that this evidences an intimate, multi-leveled, and enduring interaction between both linguistic communities. But this is not the only way to interpret this name or this evidence. It's also possible that Maelrua's monastery was founded at a site which already had a completely Pictish name of Applecrossan, perhaps keeping the name out of a desire to integrate more easily into the mix of Pictish and Gaelic culture in the area. And a further possibility may be that a religious community already existed here which Milrua moved into and further developed. Further, if the crossan element was itself a reference to Milrua's ecclesiastical foundation, then we must consider the possibility that the site was later renamed by the local population. But despite these multiple avenues of analysis for the origin of the place name Applecross, the site itself suggests the interaction of Pictish and early Gaelic peoples and cultures. This connection and the meaning of Applecross has not always been well understood, evidenced by Reeves' discussion of various erroneous etymologies of the place name given between roughly 1792 and 1854, all of which referred to a physical cross in the form of planted trees. The name of Applecross has caused some fanciful ideas regarding its etymology, if I may borrow the term from Reeves, who wrote about Applecross in 1857, and where he records some of the apocryphal etymologies of the place name. So we can see additional evidence of the blending of Pictish and Gaelic culture in the literal stone that survives from the site. The best evidence is through Applecross 1, a cross slab which until recently only survived in 3 pieces. Now we have 19. It's wonderful. Here you can see a portion of the ring, lower arm, and bottom panel of the cross in the image to the right. And in the image to the left is a portion of the right arm of the cross and a piece from the upper arm. You can see part of the armpit of the cross as well as the high level of detail that the carver was able to create. Now, from this reconstruction by Dr. Cynthia Thickpenny, you can see even more so the high level of complexity and skill that went into the creation of Applecross 1. On face A, which is the face depicted here, we see a ringed cross with pierced armpits and step and key pattern on the ring. The center of the cross shows a central circular field with interlace. And the arms of the cross show ample usage of interlace and key pattern within borders and panels. To the right side of the shaft is a panel of complex spirals, some showing bird or beast-headed terminals. The thin edge, face B, has a panel of spirals below a panel of interlace, and at the top, there's a human figure. The cross slab would have originally stood approximately 2.2 meters high and possibly have a span of 1 meter across the arms of the cross. The largely intact carving on face B suggests that only a thin layer may have been lost from face C, that being the opposite face from what we would see here. And this was a very thin cross slab for something so large. I think 95 millimeters was the thickest that survives from it. So that this is a cross slab rather than a freestanding cross shows its connection to Pictish sculptural styles, while the presence of the pierced ring in the cross shows its connection to Irish sculptural styles. It bears a notable similarity in overall shape to the Gask cross slab, described in ECMS as an interesting example of a transitional type of monument between the upright cross slab and the freestanding cross. The paneled treatment of this slab closely resembles that of Pictish cross slabs, especially those at Nig and Rosemarkie, with possible additional connections to Tarbet in Easter Ross and Farr in Sutherland. The closest parallel for the spiral roundels is slab at St. Vigian's in Angus, and these stylistic features, along with the very skilled execution of decoration on the slab, suggests a date for Applecross 1 in the 8th or 9th centuries. The strongest link, however, appears to be with Easter Ross, as noted by MacLean and Fisher and recently confirmed by Dr. Thickpenny. So Rosemarkie is a high-status Pictish site in Easter Ross. The connection is confirmed by the recent meticulous analysis by Thickpenny of the key pattern on the Rosemarkie sandstone panel, which you can see here, which has been dated to the 9th century. MacLean noted similarities between Applecross 1 and Rosemarkie 1 in the interlaced border, which frames a panel of key pattern, also with Rosemarkie 2 in the 2 vertically adjacent key patterns on each cross slab. And Thickpenny has argued convincingly that the panels at Applecross, Rosemarkie, and Nig were made by either a single master sculptor or a team of sculptors who were part of a single workshop. This suggests either the existence of a traveling sculptor or team of sculptors, or of communication and interaction between the two foundations sufficient for Applecross to have a sculptor brought to it from Easter Ross, or less likely, vice versa. But Applecross's relationship with Rosemarkie is even deeper than these stylistic similarities. It's plausible that Applecross looked to Rosemarkie as its episcopal see, especially considering that it became part of the bishopric of Ross rather than of Southriar, which composed most of the Western Isles. The closeness of the area around Rosemarkie survives into the 16th century and is included in the Aberdeen Breviary. So in the breviary, there's a story of the death of Maelrua, wherein it describes a cruel death in Urquhart on the Black Isle at the hands of Norwegians who struck him with their swords and left him for dead, to be devoured by wild dogs and birds. Though, of course, he managed to live long enough to direct that his body be taken back to Applecross. Now, this version of Maelrua's demise is undoubtedly apocryphal, as there's no record of Norwegians in the area this early. So there are 27 place names that have been identified with the Dictionary of Scottish Hagiotoponyms that may contain the name of Maelrua in one of its many forms. Of these locations, 23 are certainly associated with Maelrua and 4 are probably associated with him. And as seen here, these hagiotoponyms range from Harris in the Outer Hebrides in the west, to Keith in Moray and Crail in Fife in the east, with the actual form of Maelrua's name changing dramatically, as we saw on the slide from Reeves. So what becomes apparent when looking at the map of hagiotoponyms associated with Maelrua is the heavily sea-focused setting in which they occur. This is especially the case when looking at the western sites, including the Hebrides and the west coast of the mainland. These sites are situated such that water-based transportation would likely be the most feasible, and in some cases are locations that would be within 1 or 2 days sailing of Applecross itself. In this way, a Maelrua seascape becomes apparent within its setting, and which also ties into the larger North Channel seascape setting that reaches all the way down to Ireland. The main distribution area of his cult focuses first on Applecross and also in Lorne and Knapdale. This Lorne connection may suggest that Maelrua's cult was connected with Kennel Lorne and benefited from their expansion to the northeast in the 8th and 9th centuries. We may wonder whether the movement of Maelrua's cult was attached to an eastward movement of his relics, similar to the movement of Columba's relics to Dunkeld for safekeeping, though unfortunately there's no evidence to explain the reason for this shift. An earlier saint, Maelruagus Mór, is also associated with Kennel Lorne and experiences a similar cultic spread, which may indicate that these cults were spread together. Now, the 1656 minutes of the Presbytery of Dingwall claim that Christians in the area of Applecross, Loch Carron, Loch Alsh, Kintail, Contin, Fodderty, Gerlach, and Loch Broom, all in Rossshire, traditionally sacrificed bulls to St. Mauri, Maelrua, on his feast day, the 27th of August in Scotland, and then gave the meat to the poor and the mentally deranged, who were known as St. Mauri's afflicted ones. Now, this excerpt suggests that nearly the whole of Wester Ross and parts of Easter Ross had a tradition that acknowledged the feast day of Maelrua. Evidence of the spread of Maelrua's more eastern cult can be found at Urquhart, Contin, and Fodderty in Rossshire, Forres in Moray, Fordyce and Keith in Banffshire, Amelree in Perthshire, and Kennellan in Angus. The extent of cultic activity for Maelrua suggests that he was considered an important saint, an idea supported by his inclusion in the Aberdeen Breviary and Irish Martyrologies. So alongside this relationship with Rosemarkie stands the enduring relationship with Bangor. In 802, the annalists find it noteworthy that a MacOiga, the abbot of Bangor, was previously of Applecross, where he likely served as abbot before taking on the role at Bangor. As we have seen in the life of Columba, it did happen that a replacement abbot for the main monastery would spend time as abbot at a dependent foundation before taking the role. At Iona, this was seen in Bahana, serving as abbot of Hinba before becoming abbot of Iona upon Columba's death. We might presume that MacOiga had a similar experience. Additional evidence of the continuing relationship between Bangor and Applecross is seen in the Martyrology of Tallaght. The Martyrology was originally compiled between 828 and 833, with additional notes being added in the 12th century, meaning that it was written far after the lifetime of Maelrua himself. However, it can give us some insight into the view of the relationship between Applecross and Bangor at the time of its original composition and later annotation. The Martyrology of Tallaght includes Maelrua as an abbot of Bangor in its main text, giving it the claim a 9th century date. But we should note that a list of abbots of Bangor is included in the Antiquary of Bangor, which includes Cronan Macuculna, who died in 691. Now, it's possible that Maelrua could have served as abbot of Bangor despite his exclusion from the Antiquary, which is considered a pretty comprehensive list of abbots. The time frame within which the service would have to occur would be following the completion of the Antiquary in 700 and Maelrua's death in 722. It seems unlikely to me that he would leave his own personal foundation to take up the abbacy at Bangor. Now, it's possible that he could have held another important position at Bangor, which was later confused with taking the actual position of abbot. An undisputed abbot of Bangor, Berich, who died in 664, shares a feast day with Maelrua, and I wonder whether this could be the source of the confusion for the Martyrology. Now, considering that the Martyrology of Tallaght spent some time at Bangor, one would expect it to be a reliable witness to its abbots. But despite this confusion, it speaks to the close relationship that was understood to exist between the two foundations, whether Maelrua actually held the position of abbot or not, and that this understanding existed from the 9th and the 12th centuries. So to bring this discussion to a close, I want to describe the picture of Applecross that is painted through this evidence. We see a foundation that carries an at least partially Pictish name, yet was founded by a man from Ireland. This occurred in territory that was unarguably Pictish, but which had ties to Ireland, at the very least in Kenalnartnet. The monastery was established in a neighborhood that had already been exposed to Christianity in the work of Donnan in Eigg and Columba in the Isle of Skye. Through sculpture, cult activities, hagiotoponyms, and church organization, we see ties eastwards into the heart of northern Pictland, while at the same time we see enduring links continuing with Bangor and Ireland. Maelrua is remembered in both Irish martyrologies and the Scottish Aberdeen Breviary. So in all of this, we can see that Applecross was, from its very inception, a place of mixing of cultures and ideas between Picts and Gaels. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for that presentation of Applecross and St Maelrua. Any questions in the room, please? Or over the net, anything yet?
We have a few statements and one question, I think, online. So we have Annabelle McRae is tuning in from Applecross.
Oh, lovely.
So she was very pleased to hear that. And she says there's this very small island a couple of miles south of the monastery site in Applecross called Saint Island. Locally, it was believed that Maelrua and his monks paused there while they spied out the land. Don't know if you managed to visit that at all.
I've not managed to visit it, but I know of it, and it seems likely to me that Applecross likely would have had rights to maybe seals or other things that were on the island. And if I remember it, you would have to cross by it in order to get to Ashik in Skye, which was known as an important place that there was a bell that would ring itself as a minor miracle there, and where Maelrua was said to go and preach on Skye. So it's right there in that, Maelrua seascape that I feel strongly existed in that area.
Okay, we have a question from Peter Herbert. I was fascinated by your derivations of the name Maelrua, especially that of Row, R-O-W. We have a Row in Doon, parish of Kilmaddock, which is the name going back to the 15th century at least. Peter McNiven, in his invaluable treatise on names in Menteith, suggests Rua point promontory as our name's origin. The pronunciation of the settlement locally is Rue. Is there any possibility of a connection between Applecross and its monastery and the settlement of Roe in central Scotland?
That's a good question, and I'm not familiar with that location, but I'd be happy to take a look at it and see maybe where that falls with some of the other Milgro hagiotoponyms that we've got. They seem to be not so much in the center, but that would be an interesting thing to have a look at. Yeah, because there are, with how some of these names, change so dramatically, it's sometimes really a struggle to try and figure out where they do originate from.
Here's one that's maybe slightly easier, maybe. David asks, given the intricate carving on these crosses, have we any examples of the tools that were used?
Oh, that's a good question. So there's not been much, if any, archaeological digs at Applecross that I'm aware of. And the Bruch nearby has only had kind of small level community archaeology projects. They've left anything that's going to do big digs for kind of the professionals, which hasn't happened yet. So as far as I'm aware, we've not had anything like that to show what the cross at Applecross would have been carved with, but maybe it's still out there. And the fact that we recently found 17 more pieces of the cross in, I think it was 2020 that it was found, like what else is still out there that we might find? Maybe more bits of music too.
Okay, and I've got a final one online. Paul Corrigan says, that was super, thank you. Do you think the similarities between the Applecross stone and Rosemarkie, Nig, etc. suggest the master masons were at Port Mahomet and they went west rather than Applecross and going east?
Say that last part again.
So, do you think the master masons were at Port Mahomet and they went west rather than Applecross and going east?
I think what will probably be the first thing we'll have to look at is the specific date of the kind of cessation of work at Port Mahomet and how that might affect our timelines with these crosses at Rosemarkie and Nig and Applecross, because I know it was very purposefully destroyed at Port Mahomet, and so that would be a really big indicator of whether that's a possibility.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other questions in the room? I wonder if I can ask, Caroline, what is the sort of longer term outlook for Applecross? Obviously, you've highlighted this particular phase, but how long does the site endure? How long does it retain its importance? Is there any indications of that?
Yeah, so I think the fact that churches are being built and rebuilt into, the 1800s speaks to the longevity of the site. But, whether it was something large or small is really difficult to know based on what we've got left. Like, we can tell from this sculpture, like, to be able to afford to get somebody to come and make this sculpture, you've got to have, some reputation, you've got to have some money in order to do this. And so that speaks to the importance of the site at that time. But once we get a bit further after that, the sources just really fall away quite a bit. And that's partially why this sculpture is so helpful, because we don't have sources for Applecross at that time. So it's the sculpture itself that tells us of its importance. So maybe there will be future digs, and that will give us lots more, and we can know more about what Applecross got up to between, the 9th century and, 1700s, when we know there was another church before the one that survives today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, if there are no more questions, can we thank Caroline again for her interesting contribution on Applecross? Thank you very much. And it remains for me simply to bring our proceedings to a conclusion for tonight and to invite you for a drink, which we have provided at the back, and to let you know that the next meeting is, of course, the Rind Lectures, and they're scheduled for the 10th to the 12th of June. The topic is Unearthing the African Diaspora, and our speaker will be Professor Teresa Singleton, who I think is in Cambridge at the moment. So the 10th to the 12th of June for Unearthing the African Diaspora. Thank you all very much.